Warning: the following podcast contains graphic content that may be disturbing or triggering to some listeners. Discretion is advised. The papatangosierradelta podcast is available free of charge thanks to the support of Cracked Armor.
Their mission is to raise awareness for PTSD, TBI, and mental health to support those who struggle. By creating an army of warriors who represent the gear, their hope is that it will send a message to others that they are not alone.
Go to crackedarmor.com. Say hi to Mark Long, read about the story, and find some research information about PTSD. And if you can, look good while supporting Cracked Armor by buying some gear.
(10-9). Did you say Papa Tango Sierra Delta? 10-4.
There's so much left to do, so many things I wanna say, and I say, don't make the change. If it rains every single day, I'll fight to blow it all away.
This is episode 16 of the Papa Tango Sierra Delta podcast. My name is Larry Payton, and I have been diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress. Earlier this week, I was an invited guest to attend the Tema Foundation's 2023 Halifax Mental Health Education Day. It was an honor to be there and an honor to feel validated by the work being done on this podcast, which is what led to my invitation. There's a lot of great speakers who offered fantastic presentations during the event, and there were over 400 attendees. I unfortunately didn't get to speak with many people. It was just the way things worked out that day. Though I am grateful I did have the chance to speak with Nicole and Kirk, who are listeners of the show and paramedics in New Brunswick. There were some amazing speakers there, as I already mentioned, one of whom was Daniel Sundall. You can find his artwork at Dan Sun Photo Art. And when you look at it, I will give you a warning that it may be triggering. However, you can certainly tell that Dan lived in the shit and fought through the shit because of his ability to so amazingly capture the shit. He shows the realities of our world. He shows some of the traumatic things that we see, that we witness, that we experience. But he's also able to capture other things that go on there that we don't see. Let me give you an example. One piece of his artwork that really resonated with me is of a paramedic who's being pulled in opposite directions. His face is completely worry-free, stoic, or arguably he's completely withdrawn. His right arm is being pulled by a demon, while his left is being pulled by his peers and his colleagues, a nurse, a firefighter, paramedic, police officer. That is the struggle of PTSD, right there, captured in one image. It can be interpreted that he is in the middle of the struggle right now, that a demon is trying to pull him one way and his peers are trying to pull him another. It can also be interpreted that he has already committed the act of attempting suicide, and the demon is trying to take him one way, while his peers and colleagues are trying to save him. Regardless, it hits home very clearly the demons that can be inside us because of our traumatic experiences. Speaking of that, let me tell you about a mental health awareness ride I did this week with Kendall Toole on Peloton. Listening to Kendall speak during that ride was very indicative that she has also been through mental health struggles. There's a lot of things she said that were quite uplifting, quite deep, quite thought-provoking. One of the things that really stuck with me was her way to identify demons. And so this is what she says you should do. Go into the mirror and look. Look at you. Look at the reflection and just stand there. Say nothing. Just look. If you can hear negativity, if you can hear shitty things, if thoughts are going through your mind that you're overweight, that you're underweight, that you have scars on your face, that you have wrinkles, that you're not young, that you don't like whatever it is about yourself, then that is the indication you have a demon in you, because you would not say those things to yourself. It's that shittiness inside of us that makes us see the shittiness outside of us. Because let's be honest, how many fucking times when you were a kid, and I mean before shitty things that happen, I mean you're just an innocent kid that happens to see a reflection in the mirror. I mean, we made faces at ourselves, you'd fucking do all kinds of funny shit. But we certainly never looked and said, you're fucking useless. You're worthless. Everyone hates you. You're a fucking loser. There's nothing to live for. No. Fuck no. You know why? Because the demon wasn't in us. That's the point. That is what PTSD is. That is what fucking a lot of mental health problems are. The demon. There's a demon. And it's your experience with trauma that has given birth to that motherfucker. Daniel Sundahl is able to capture it on his images. And so I really recommend, again, go take a look and realize what you do have living inside you and that it is not you. That you deserve wellness, that you deserve mental health stability, that you deserve to move on, to move forward, and to live. And there are others out there who love you. Let me return back to the Tema Foundation Day. One of the oddities that struck me was when I spoke to some people who were operating at the event. I asked if they ever wanted to come on the show, and some responses I got were that they were associated already with a local podcast on PTSD. Okay, I'm not really sure what that matters. I'm kind of lost on that. I just want to talk about the problems. And let me be blunt, transparent, completely honest, because, hey, anyone who's been listening to this for a while knows that's my modus operandi. I don't give a fuck. And let me repeat that. I don't give a fuck. If you listen to another podcast and not listen to this, and you are getting the help you need, I am thrilled and ecstatic. If you find other things to do, and this is no longer being of any service to you, whether you are now hiking, exercising, walking the dog, spending time with people, you're able to get out and socialize again, you're no longer hypervigilant, you want to live, I am thrilled. Because ultimately, the only thing I give a fuck about is that my brothers and sisters move forward, move onward, and wake up tomorrow morning to be able to fight again. That's all I care about. I don't really give a shit how you get there. I just want you to get there. I just do not want any of my brothers and sisters to be another fucking statistic in the suicide epidemic. Yes, you are struggling. Yes, you are suffering. Yes, you are withdrawn, hypervigilant, having night terrors, angry, anxious, depressed. But yes, you can find some sense of relief. Yes, you can find some sense of recovery. And yes, you can find some sense of post-traumatic growth. I don't care how you get there. I just want you to never extinguish your light and somehow find a way to keep going on. I want to talk about an email that I received this week as well. The subject line says, "Hi from Australia. Hey Larry, congratulations. You have convinced me to write to a podcast author for the first time ever. I have been in law enforcement for 23 years, and I have my own diagnosis of PTSD. I really wanted to contact you for two reasons. The first is on the content of episode 11. Many times in my mental health journey, people have expressed to me that their own PTSD or mental health was lesser than my own because, in quotes, I have been through so much more than them. We need to stop pretending there is equality in PTSD. Each diagnosis and person is unique, and we should never look down on another's experience. You handled this so well in the episode by showing great compassion to your guest and his experience. Very different than mine and no doubt yours, but damaging nonetheless. The second reason I wanted to write was to say thank you for doing the Papa Tango podcast. The hardest thing in my own journey before I sought help was understanding that what I was feeling was a normal response to the abnormal experience. That the tears that bubbled up whilst watching a nappy commercial on TV were okay, and I wasn't crazy. Podcasts such as yours would have been so helpful to me, and I have no doubt are helping countless others in the community. So thank you for what you do from the bottom of my heart. Keep doing what you do, brother, and I have your six." Thank you for that email. I really appreciate it. Thank you to those who are listening. I really appreciate it. And I just want you to get well. and I will be here for you along the way. Please know that. I have your six. I'm right beside you. Let's take a quick break. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into the podcast. If you have experience with post-traumatic stress and would like to join me for an episode, please reach out to me. You can contact me via direct message on Instagram, PTSD_podcast, or you can send me an email at papatangosierradelta@gmail.com. Cheers. We are back from the break. Thank you for sticking around for the Papa Tango Sierra Delta podcast. On today's episode, I'm happy to introduce a counselor from Newfoundland and Labrador, Brendan St. Croix. What's up, buddy?
How you doing, Larry? Thanks for having me on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm quite happy to have you here. We just had a little conversation off air before recording. For those who are taking a listen to see what's this one about, Brandon's going to have some great things to share with you, hopefully to tear down some of those walls in terms of fears of speaking with a therapist or a counselor, about setting those parameters, feeling safe. You know what? I'm not going to take the words away. We're going to get into it with Brandon. Why don't we start off with just tell us about your journey?
I come from a social work background, and even before becoming a therapist, my background was actually in child protection in Northern Labrador. And that's where I've got to see kind of firsthand how trauma can definitely impact individuals. And unknown to myself until I actually got out of working in Northern Labrador, where I'm working in child protection, I realized how trauma can impact myself. It wasn't until probably I was up there for about 2 years. And after getting out, I started working in the field of mental health as a therapist. I started experiencing my own trauma flashbacks. Hadn't been diagnosed with PTSD myself, but definitely experienced the night terrors, the flashbacks. And honestly, Larry, I pushed it down for a long time and thinking, well, I'm a therapist. I should know what to do. I know all the stuff. I'll just face it myself. And thinking, what's the therapist going to tell me that I don't already know or that I'm not already telling clients of mine?
Yeah, it's understandable. Absolutely.
Because again, it's that idea of like, okay, I do this for a living. If I don't know this, then what am I even doing in this field?
Understandable, man. I get it. Yeah, I get it.
Again, it's that part where we got that mentality of, we know this is fine, we'll push it down, we can trudge forward. And it's easy to think that way. And I've known other individuals who work in my field who think or thought in that way for a long time. But it wasn't until probably 3 or 4 years out of being in the Labrador and experiencing things off and on that I remember waking up in the middle of the night in a full-on panic attack and just screaming and looking over at my partner, and I could see the fear in her face. And that was enough for me to say, okay, this needs to be dealt with. I can't just keep pushing it down and pretending that things are okay.
Wow.
So after a few conversations back and forth, calling employee assistance program, finally swallowing my own thoughts, I said, let's get this dealt with. And got set up with a really good therapist who knew trauma, knew the area of work, and knew kind of what steps to take. And that's where I learned, okay, this is the area where I also want to practice. So did some therapy for a couple months, learned a lot of skills, was able to communicate that with other people, and became open to talking about it with friends, family members, other therapists, other social workers, and said, hey, this is part of my journey. This is part of my experience. And realizing, okay, even as a barber, got to go to another barber to get their hair cut. That's something that my own therapist said to me, which was probably the most powerful thing that I needed to hear.
Which is true. Absolutely true. Something we never really think about, but true.
So following that, I ended up sticking with the mental health program in different capacities. And in my current role, I work as a trauma counselor who works with complex PTSD. So I was involved in individual service and groups for individuals who've experienced complex trauma from various walks of life.
Tell us from your side, kind of, I guess, an idea of the typical things, you see in terms of symptoms that people don't yet recognize. Tell us about your experience in terms of dealing with people like that and how people can move forward.
One of the biggest things that we often see when individuals have experienced complex trauma is the numerous diagnoses or the numerous symptoms that present that people think, okay, I have anxiety, I have depression, I have chronic pain, I have other physical health concerns, or I have borderline personality disorder, or I have bipolar, which again are all parts of the experience of complex trauma. It's stuff that presents in different ways, and the ways that we've been impacted by trauma can present in other fashions. And like I often say, it often wears so many different types of clothes. It can, one day be a sweater where it presents as anxiety and panic disorder. In other days, it can be wearing a snowsuit, which can look like depression. In other days, it can be feeling the physical pains of anxiety through, let's say, chronic pain. It could be through fibromyalgia. So many different ways that complex PTSD can present. And it's all about how does it impact those areas of life in terms of that fight, flight, or freeze response, what safety looks like for us in terms of those thinking traps. Oftentimes people question, okay, who am I? What is my role here? Is there a benefit for me being here? And we start to go to some of those really dark places.
And some of those people, I mean, I'm one of those people when you talk about changing shirts. I change shirts frequently in a day in the sense that I can start off being very depressed and move into numbness, to an anxiety, back to depressed. It's a myriad of emotions that can happen in a very short amount of time.
And it's really easy for an individual to be either misdiagnosed, or some people think, okay, in order for me to get help, I need to have a diagnosis of PTSD or complex PTSD. But oftentimes I say to people, most therapists you talk to, they will say to you, it doesn't matter if you have the official diagnosis or if you're showing signs and symptoms, your care is still deserved, your recovery is still deserved. Let's still work on the same treatment plan. So again, it's looking at the individual based on their experiences and based on their impacts of life, more so than having the technical diagnosis itself.
I agree with that 100%. The diagnosis is really, in my opinion, serves nothing more unless you're going through Veterans Affairs Canada, WCB, WSIB, whatever. Ultimately, it's just you dealing with your realities of, again, that myriad of emotions, those night terrors, those sweats, that pain. It really shouldn't matter. So for you, Brandon, again, you're not looking for someone that has an official diagnosis. You're just looking to help. Is that right?
Exactly. Because I think at the end of the day, sometimes the struggle that people have to go through, sometimes there's so many hoops and layers that people have to jump through to get a full diagnosis. That only increases the amount of stress and, in a lot of ways, a lot of BS that people have to go through to get a diagnosis. And it increases the person's frustration, increases the person's stress level, it decreases the level of hope, it decreases the person's support around them, it decreases their energy and motivation around us. So I often say, your experience is valid. You don't have to prove anything to a therapist. You don't have to prove that your experience happened. But again, what really has happened is that you're experiencing the impacts that trauma's had on you, and you have a right to feel well.
So we often talk about on the show here, psychologists, psychiatrists, but people can reach out to therapists in other forms, again, like your background, being a counselor.
And there's so many different avenues that people don't always recognize. Sometimes people think, okay, I have complex trauma, so I need to see psychiatrists. And psychiatrists definitely play a great role in terms of a person's care. But there's so many other aspects that people can have. In terms of a lot of the staff that I work with, people come from a social background, an occupational therapist background, a psychology background, a psychiatric nurse background. And it's all about what's that skill set. And one of the biggest things when working with someone who's experienced trauma is how can we make sure that person feels safe? Because one thing that trauma tells us that we're not safe. We've endured things in our life that showed us what being unsafe looks like. And then when we experience that trauma over and over, we see that trigger presented in so many different ways. And oftentimes the brain is not able to recognize when we're feeling safe or not feeling safe, especially when the middle part of our brain, the hippocampus, we almost call it the alarm system, when that's running on full tank and the bells and whistles are all going off, that fight, flight, or freeze response is activated. And it's almost like being in a room with the strobe lights going, the alarm bells are ringing on max, and we're not able to focus and concentrate. And again, that's when we get in that state of feeling overwhelmed and triggered and not feeling safe. So one of the biggest things as a therapist is what do we need to do to ensure the person feels safe in that moment? So it's not jumping into their trauma experience right off the bat. It's making sure, okay, what does safety look like for you? What does safety look like in terms of our surroundings? What are the things that help us feel safe and know what safety looks like? It's understanding that person as they are and where they're to in their journey. We're all different places in our journey. So again, it's getting to know the person as a person and not jumping into their experience of trauma right away.
And that's key. I mean, it's pivotal. I know, big surprise, as a police officer and first responders and military, all kinds of other work. I mean, social workers for sure, nurses, corrections, border agency officials. I mean, we can go on and on. But once you do this job long enough, you really see some of the worst things in life and you become hypervigilant, as opposed to, for lack of a better term, the enemy, the other combatant, being somewhere else fighting in a foreign land. the combatants that we deal with are here. And so, Mark Long from Cracked Armor had once said, the issue is, he arrests a guy tonight, and then on Saturday, he's in Walmart with his wife and his kids, and that person's there. And it makes you feel very, very vulnerable. So, Brandon, when you talk about hypervigilance and creating those safe spaces, I'm presuming that becomes very individualized. How would you go about creating safety for each individual person?
One of the biggest things is knowing what relates to them. One thing you've talked about a lot in the podcast is around yoga. So again, it's figuring out, okay, what does grounding and mindfulness look like for them? For some people, it's going to be yoga. For other people, it's going to be deep breathing. For other people, it's going to be art. For other people, it's going to be walking the woods. For other people, it's going to be listening to music. It's knowing what relates to them. And working with some individuals, I talk about doing deep breathing, and they say, no, I'm not there yet. It's not something I feel comfortable with. But I'll talk to them about going for a walk in the woods or being on a ATV and driving an ATV and say, okay, what do you focus on when you're driving an ATV? Well, I'm focused on the trail ahead of me. I'm focused on, is there any stumps in the woods? Is there any rocks? Is there, is the path turning left? Is the path turning right? I say, exactly. That's mindfulness. You're focused on the present moment and not being judgmental about it. It's allowing ourselves just to be present and not racing our thoughts to the past, not racing our thoughts to the future, but allowing ourselves just to be in the present moment and accepting the moment as it is and not having judgment about it. So again, it's understanding that person and what matters to them and really connecting to them on the level of where they are. If I place a judgment on a person or if I tell them where they should be, that's only increasing the guilt and shame that they're already feeling as part of their traumatic experience.
I'm loving this conversation because it's bringing some things into focus for me as well. I know you talk about the yoga and the meditation. Probably about, 2 months ago, I was talking to my therapist and I told her that, I had a little bit of a freak out last night in bed and I just did the yoga breathing and it put me to sleep. And she chuckled and she's like, I told you about that like 18 months ago. I was like, well, just wasn't ready. I mean, I just thought this breathing shit was just hooey-fooey kind of stuff. But, it's the reality a lot of times of, again, finding that safe zone and finding that comfort level, but also for people who are struggling to be open to trying new things. And I think that's a big lesson that I've learned. Brandon, people oftentimes have absolutely no idea how to find someone they can trust. I know, for example, I held mine in for a long time because I really was fearful of repercussions that would potentially occur if I spoke to someone within my own organization, if I spoke to teammates, if I spoke to superiors. And so the last thing I would ever do is do that. Then I also had a fear that access could be obtained to my medical records. And so I hid it. I kept it buried until it, eventually, almost 20 years later, raised its ugly head. How is it people can go about finding a person to speak with outside of their organization, being able to get help on their own?
In terms of, like I said, reaching out for help, it can look different for some people. Some people will look up, hey, what are the public supports that are in my area in terms of under the Medicare system? And in terms of having a conversation with their providers and say, okay, here's the situation. I'm worried about the information being disclosed or information being requested by, again, my employer. And one conversation I've had numerous times in the public sector is, your information is your information. You have to give consent for it to be released in terms of what is being able to be released and what isn't. And that's a choice that the client gets, not so much a provider or even an outside party such as our employer. So having a conversation in terms of, hey, this is what my fear is. This is what my barrier sometimes to service is. And even when we write our case notes as therapists, we leave them very brief for a reason. Again, we understand that this is a very sensitive topic for folks. We understand that the information that's within a person's story and their recovery story and journey can often be very upsetting, can be very personal, and it can be a lot for people there as well. And ensuring that people's safety and privacy is held is one of the biggest aspects of the therapeutic relationship. So that's one aspect in terms of the public sector. But again, if someone was to reach out through a private sector, having that same conversation in terms of being transparent, it takes a lot to allow ourselves to be transparent. It takes a lot of vulnerability. It takes a lot of trust. And trust is something that's often been broken based on the systems we work in, the systems we've been involved in, based on our experience of trauma. Trust is something that can be really hard for us to build. But knowing, okay, what are the aspects that are important to me, and saying to our therapists, and even in a private setting, and saying, okay, here are my fears in terms of reaching out. What would my case notes look like? So again, having that understanding that, okay, is everything I share need to be documented? Is there certain things that need to be documented? And if my information is requested, what can be withheld and what has to be disclosed? And oftentimes therapists will talk about, in my case notes, this is what will be documented. This is what we can hold out. And one of the biggest things around documentation is safety. If someone is a risk to safety to themselves or others, those are things that does have to be documented. But in terms of some of the details of their own experience, those things can oftentimes be withheld. Because again, it's understanding what's actually relevant to their therapeutic relationship and the therapeutic journey for them.
So when you talk about then the threat of people hurting themselves or others, let's get into the realities of the number of people that now, especially, we seem to see a lot of it, in terms of first responders, military. I mean, it's happened a lot on this side of the border and even worse on our southern side of the border. What is it in your experience you're seeing in terms of what I believe is a suicide epidemic? Because again, people just aren't reaching out. I mean, is that something that you're seeing as well?
Definitely seen in so many different sectors, including first responders, and sadly, even including my own field in terms of therapy. And I think one of the biggest parts of it, and oftentimes when I talk about suicide, I often talk about a funnel. And if we look at a funnel, on the top side, it's wide. We can see, the light is coming in. And if we picture ourselves on the top ring of that funnel, we can see a lot of our supports. We can see in terms of what our life has to offer. We can see a lot of the brightness come into our life and know, hey, this is what my life worth living is. This is what I bring to life and bring to life of others. We can see all those positive things. But oftentimes what brings us lower into that funnel is the isolation, is that withdrawal, is the experience of trauma, of guilt and shame that brings us deeper into it and makes things darker. As we go each level of that funnel and get deeper and deeper, it gets darker. It's harder to see those supports. It's harder to see the strengths that we have. It's harder to see the tools and the options we have around us. And sometimes, sadly, some individuals get to the point where they're very low in their funnel and they only see that one option out. And it's something where some people say, oh, what was going on with that person? Why didn't they reach out? They knew all the tools, they knew all the skills, they work as a first responder, they know all the supports out there. And the way I sometimes say to people is that even if someone lived in their home for 25 years, they know everything where the stairs is, where the bench is, where the dog bowl is, and the power went out in the middle of the night, and we got up, and it's pitch black out there. We would still run into our kitchen table. We would still trip over the stairs. We would still trip over the dog bowl. Because again, when things are that dark, even though we know where everything is, and we've been around the spot for 25 years, it's hard to see all those things when all we see is darkness around us.
That is a remarkable metaphor. Wow. I love it. I love it. I love it. I think that is going to really resonate with a lot of listeners that are going to be able to all of a sudden have some way to explain their fears, their thoughts, their concerns with their therapist, their loved ones, their friends, whomever, just to be able to, again, have those words to just go, this is what I'm feeling. That's, Brandon, that's awesome. That's fantastic. Do you feel when you talk about isolation, did the pandemic exacerbate that?
The pandemic definitely had, I almost call it a dual effect. So for some individuals, the pandemic was hard in terms of increasing that isolation, in terms of cutting out a lot of our supports, in terms of isolating us away from some people. But also what we see in the pandemic was almost this another wave of health, where it was the mental health wave, where as things are starting to open up, people have been isolated for a long time, so we've been able to avoid seeing certain people, and we haven't had to have the excuse of, oh, it's been because of the pandemic, or it's because of lockdowns, I haven't seen people. It gave people that kind of out to say, okay, I haven't wanted to see people because of my experience of trauma, or because I haven't been feeling mentally well, but I can say it's the pandemic. Now that things are opening up more, people can say, oh, it's because of the pandemic, it's because of COVID, it's because of the lockdowns. And we're starting to see some of these impacts present even stronger now than what it was before, because we've had 2.5, 3 years where the pandemic has given us that reason. But now we're looking at it and saying, okay, now I have to say there's something different. Now I have to say it's not the pandemic. Now I have to go out to this social event. Now I have to be in the office more. Now I have to be around my family more. Now it's harder for me to set these boundaries that I may have had or may have been easier to set during the pandemic. So I think it's definitely a double-edged sword in some ways. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. No, I agree 100%. I mean, I'm guilty of that as well. Not in the sense that I'm coming up for excuses. I damn well know what the issue is, but my diagnosis coincided with the pandemic, had absolutely nothing to do with the pandemic whatsoever. The straw that broke the camel's back was the incident here in Nova Scotia, which I won't get into, but then all of a sudden being able to lock yourself down into what became a safe zone, a safety net. I mean, it's great, but it has also really put me very uncomfortable being in a lot of social settings, very uncomfortable with leaving my house when it's getting dark out in the evenings, very uncomfortable when people just come to the door. It's changed things. I'm happy, as you said, the double-edged sword, that I created a safe space, but it's also really protecting that space and really not wanting to leave the boundaries of it or allow others inside the boundaries of it. And to me, the pandemic, I think, would have done that for a lot of people, just because that's the way it was. You were locked down and you had a reason for it. But one of the things I will say that I feel has been good with the pandemic is the fact that we used other options, used Zoom or used FaceTime or whatever. And I know that was an option that I was able to use with my therapist for almost 2 years. So at the very least, my sessions could continue as opposed to be left out in the dark. Is that something that was going on back in Newfoundland, Brandon? Is it something that's still an option to people? Do people have to come in? How does it work there?
No, I would definitely say here in Newfoundland, we've seen very much similar thing, and it's definitely been a great option in terms of in the public sector. When we're running our groups, we used to have a group room where we could run 5-6 groups a week at max. Now, with the ability to have Zoom, we're able to run upwards of 10 to 12 groups a week. Because again, we can have a group going on in our boardroom, we can have a virtual group going on at the same time. And there's even days where we have 2 virtual groups going on in the mornings, 1 or 2 in the afternoon, and then one in person in the morning and 1 in person in the afternoon. So we can be running 5 or 6 groups a day sometimes compared to being able to run 5 or 6 a week at most. So again, that's been a great option in terms of our group and our individual options we run. And even in terms of private services, as someone who works in both the public and the private sector, most of my private work has been done virtually. It opens up the comfortability for people. People feel, hey, I'm in a safe setting where one of my tools in terms of my safety place is sitting in a certain chair that I feel safe in, or it's having my stuff around me that feels safe. Okay, it's picking up a stress ball that is mine, that I own. It's not picking up a therapist's stress ball that, it doesn't mean anything to me. Or it's picking up a certain blanket, that self-soothing piece when we talk about reprocessing. It's being able to say, hey, what are things we can help do to reprocess and ground ourselves? Because to properly be able to reprocess the trauma we experience, we need to be able to also ground our mind and use our frontal cortex properly. But when our hippocampus is on high alert, again, that's the alarm system going off, the bells and whistles, our frontal cortex doesn't work at the same time that our hippocampus is on. So it's being able to rest our hippocampus and activate our frontal cortex, which is around decision-making and processing information and memories. So again, Zoom has definitely helped us to be able to take down some of those barriers for folks, help in rural areas of the province where those supports aren't always there, or if they are, they're 2, 3, 4 hour drives away. And even in terms of some people feel, hey, I'm really nervous about seeing someone in my home community or in the area I work. Just for example, if we had a police officer based in St. Anthony, Newfoundland Labrador, and they're feeling, hey, I know that there's mental health service here in St. Anthony, but I'm worried about reaching out what that might look like. They can sometimes be able to avail of services with someone who's in Gander, which again, you're looking at a 8-hour drive from St. Anthony to Gander. Or they might be able to see someone in, Mount Pearl, or they could see someone in Goose Bay. So you're talking numerous hours outside their hometown. But again, you're able to do that from the comfort of your own home. Feel safe. For some people, they feel that's a better connection for them.
For me, it can also be just very fluid in the sense that there are days that I really want to go and I'm good to go. And there are days that I just want to talk and I want to remain in the safety. So I think it's a great option that's come out. I do try to find the silver lining in all the shitstorms, so that at least is one good thing that came out of the pandemic. Brandon, here's the reality. And I wonder how someone in your position deals with the mentality of many first responders and military members, in the sense that we are all trained to be survivors, to be warriors, combat breathing. You need to make sure you're the one that makes it home at the end of the shift, so on and so forth. I mean, that's got to have its own difficulty to break through for a person who's in a therapist position trying to help. How is it that you get through to people like me?
And I think too, that word you said, that's one of the key parts. It's that warrior mentality. It's that idea that, okay, I got to show strength. I got to not back down. I got to show no weakness. I got to be the one that's there for everyone else around me.
That's right.
So when we talk about what true strength is, when we talk about not showing weakness, when we talk about bravery and courage, what is that? And sometimes I say to people, okay, what takes more strength and what takes more bravery and what takes that internal power that we have? Is it to be silent, or is it to take a stand for what's hard? Because again, I often say this work is not easy. It takes a lot of strength, a lot of courage, a lot of vulnerability to do this work. And the ability to be able to talk about it is not an easy journey. But again, that's what true strength is. It's being able to understand that and validate that experience. Because oftentimes I talk to people about our brain is kind of split in two ways, where we got that emotional mind and we got the rational mind. Somewhere in the middle, we got a small section that we call wise mind. And oftentimes first responders jump to the rational mind. It's okay, what's the best choice? What makes sense? What's the pros and cons? Okay, let's put it in action. But it's being able to touch on that emotional mind to say, okay, I revalidate this experience. Because there's nothing worse, Larry. I'm sure you've had people on who've experienced it. You may have experienced it yourself, who've had people say to them, well, just get over it, or just not feeling that way, or just kind of move forward, or man up. Those are the things we hear.
Absolutely.
And sadly, sometimes we even do it to ourselves.
Absolutely. Yep.
And there's nothing worse than feeling invalidated. It's one of the shittiest feelings in the world to feel that invalidation. But sometimes we do it for ourselves. We say, okay, I got to get over this. So I got to move forward. And that's our rational brains speaking. So sometimes I even say to people, give yourself 10 seconds just to sit there and say, you know what? This sucks. Or this is fucking hard. Or this is really difficult. Or I really don't like this right now. Just the ability to say that to ourselves, that's a step in the right direction. But also it's being able to understand we have emotions. We're allowed to have emotions. We're allowed to feel things. And we're allowed to have wellness as well. We're allowed to be on this recovery journey.
And another thing to add to that, which I would love you to be able to touch on, is the ideology or concept of masculinity. That men don't cry, that men don't back down, that men always fight no matter what, that you're supposed to be strong, you're supposed to always get up. Masculinity, I find, is problematic for a lot of people. And not just guys. I mean, I speak about being at the Cracked Armor booth a lot of times. And a few weeks ago when I was there was actually a husband and wife there. And, we got into talking. He has PTSD. We were speaking with him. And his wife had no problem speaking up and saying that, yeah, the crying thing, she doesn't really have time for that shit. Like, get yourself together. There's no fucking around with crying. And I really felt genuinely fucking bad for that guy in the sense that, this is someone that you should have the most trust with. At least I do in my relationship with my wife. And I can't imagine where I expect to get validation almost no matter what. It's frowned upon. So, what are you seeing when all of a sudden now you're dealing with first responders, military members, the general public, and they have this bullshit old school concept of masculinity?
And oftentimes I ask people, okay, what's their experience? It's easy for someone to come back and say, well, this is why I was not right, and this is in challenge. But again, sometimes I say, okay, let's throw the ball back in your court. What's been the benefits of this masculinity, of this idea of being tough, of sucking up, of don't cry, of being able to, again, the man up idea? And just asking that individual. And, sometimes it's, well, this is what society wants. Okay, so is that the only benefit? And oftentimes it tends to be, yep, that's what society tells me. Or sometimes we'll hear, okay, it hasn't been safe, which again is a valid feeling. Okay, it hasn't been safe to cry. But I often say to people, okay, what's been the cons or what's been the negative things of this? Well, I lash in other ways. I show anger. I have to drywall the basement 4 times because I'm not going to put my fist through it when I get pissed off. It's impacting my relationship. It's impacting me at work. It's impacting my connection to my kids. So we can see all those negative sides of things. And one thing we know about emotions, they need to come out somehow. If we took a can of Pepsi and shook it up, it's going to explode. Because again, all that energy got to come out somehow. So what are healthier ways we can still release that energy? Crying is a way that it gets released. Anger is another way. But if we got 2 options, what's the better way? But one thing we know, sadly, especially with males, is that it's easier to show anger than it is to show sadness, or it's easier to be mad than it is to be sad. But it's being able to have the conversation around, okay, what's been the benefits of this? And you know what, there may be some benefits that's come out of it. But again, what's been the negative sides? And oftentimes we can pull out a lot more negatives to showing anger in terms of bottling up that emotion, in terms of trying to suck it up, than we have when we look at the other ways. Okay, what are other healthier ways that we can channel this energy? What are the impacts that's having on all these different areas of life, in terms of our friends, in terms of our family, in terms of our work, in terms of our own mental health, in terms of how we are able to sleep, in terms of how we view ourselves? All these impacts come to the forefront.
I'm here just thinking now in terms of, the being mad versus actually crying. I mean, I would always flip to a state of rage, always. And I look at it now and sort of go, I think I do that because I feel in a state of rage that I am in more control and less vulnerable than if I was crying. However, fast forward a few months where I've stepped back from work and my stress level has significantly decreased and I've done better at healing and taking care of myself. I look back now and go, yeah, that rage actually put me in a lot worse positions than crying ever would have.
And the other part about there, Larry, one thing I say to all clients, no matter if they're first responders, if they've experienced childhood trauma, if they've experienced any form of trauma, or even any form of experience that's led them to counseling, we do the best we can with the tools and skills we got. If you've never been taught Spanish, I can't expect you to speak Spanish. And sometimes we get hard on ourselves for thinking, oh, I should have done this different. I should do that different. Oh, I know this stuff now. I should have been doing this long ago. We did the best we could with the tools and skills we had at the time. And what therapy is about is growing and trading in our toolbox. I often use lots of random analogies. And one I talk about is probably one of my favorite ones. It's, okay, we got a set of screwdrivers and hammers that we're going to be building a house with. Can we do it? Yeah, we can probably build a house with screwdrivers. Is it going to be a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of difficulty, a lot of frustration? Yeah. But is it possible? Sure. But if we're able to trade in our screwdrivers and our hammer for power tools, and we're able to have our drills, and we're able to have all of our electric tools, we're going to be more effective to be able to build our house. We're going to be able to be less frustrated. We're going to be able to handle things a lot better. What therapy is all about is trading in our screwdrivers for drills and impact drills to be able to have that new tools that we can pull out. So instead of resorting to our past tools, we have a new toolbox that we can pull out when we need to.
It's fantastic. Absolutely awesome. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back from the break, Brandon's going to tell us a little bit about identifying that maybe you should go speak to someone, you should seek therapy. And also, if you have already been diagnosed or you know you have a problem, how it is you can get out there and start dealing with it and start figuring out how you can get help. Be back just after this.
This episode of the Papa Tango Sierra Delta podcast is brought to you thanks to the support and financial sponsorship of Cracked Armor. Go to crackedarmor.com, read the story, buy the gear, wear it, to send a message to others who are struggling that they're not alone.
Also, check out Willow Tree Farm, care of Jason Subkowicz, another member who is struggling with PTSD and who frequently updates his Instagram to share his story. You can follow him at jason.subkowicz. That's jason.Sierra Oscar Bravo Kilo Oscar Whiskey India Charlie Zulu.
We are back from the break. Thank you for staying tuned in to the Papa Tango Sierra Delta podcast. We're going to return with Brandon, who is a counselor / therapist out of Newfoundland and Labrador. And Brandon, before we went to the break, I'd mentioned people who are listening to this and are not sure. I mean, they feel like they're struggling, but they're sort of on that cusp. Do I need to go talk to somebody? Can I just handle this on my own? What are some things that they should be looking for? What is some advice that you would give those people?
One thing I'll say, both from a professional and personal standpoint, if there's something that we're questioning in terms of, hey, should I or should I not get this looked into? Should I go to therapy? Then go. Because sometimes, too, that questioning, if it's coming across our mind and we're kind of hemming and hawing and there's something there, that's something. And really, there's no harm in going. It doesn't mean we have to commit to a lifelong of therapy of going every week for the rest of our lives. It doesn't mean we have to go on this journey right now. But again, even looking into it is no different if we started having soreness in our shoulder and we were questioning, oh, what's been going on for a couple of weeks and it's bothering me. We wouldn't hesitate to reach out to our family doctor or to seek medical advice. But if for some reason when it comes to mental health, sometimes we put it off. I say to people, make the call and say, hey, I want to talk to someone. We may not dive into that it's trauma right away. We may say, hey, I'm really experiencing some anxiety and I want to talk to someone. And that might be just a start. And just be able to feel that sense of, okay, I've spoke to someone and it took away some of those worries. Because sometimes we worry if I speak to someone, it's going to impact all different areas of life. But oftentimes what happens is we get that sense of relief. We kind of bring ourselves even a bit higher in that funnel that we talked about before the break. We're able to recognize, okay, we're able to learn maybe a new tool or new skill. And it might point us in some direction. And it may return to us coming to therapy at another time. Or it may give us some sense of understanding, okay, therapy wasn't that bad. It was able to feel a sense of hope. It was able to give us some of that resiliency that sometimes we don't always feel when we're in some of those dark places. It was able to give us that education, that self-advocacy, and a place of support, and we're able to feel a sense of safety. Because again, sometimes we don't feel safety for a long, long time. So sometimes I say to people, if we're questioning, reach out to someone that we do feel will be a place of support. If it means connecting to our nearest regional health authority and looking in terms of, okay, where's the nearest walk-in, or looking online at places such as Psychology Today or other means that are in our area for private clinicians that offer either Zoom or in person, depending on what we're looking for. Or connecting to people such as peer support. So again, I know here in Newfoundland Labrador they have Channel, which is a peer support line where people can call to reach out for help. These are phone numbers that people don't have to even give their full name. They can say, hey, my name is Peter Pan and I'm really struggling with anxiety, or I've experienced a lot and I just need someone to talk to right now. So again, if we're questioning something, there's something there. So it's exploring it and doing it in safe ways for us. And that can look different for all of us right now. But again, it could be reaching out through peer support, it can be reaching out through our regional health authority, or reaching out through private options that we feel comfortable with.
In terms of people who are going to a therapist, who have been diagnosed, who are dealing with this for a number of years, but are still finding it very difficult to see any light to get to the right end of that funnel, what other things can they be doing? I know you just mentioned one of them, which I think is very important. I hated the idea of it. I absolutely fucking despise the concept of it. However, peer support is huge, and it's done wonders for me. Is there anything else people can do besides seeing their therapists?
I think one of the biggest things, and I've seen this in numerous different areas, even in terms of some of the work I do, in terms of groups, in terms of people sometimes think group therapy is a second-class therapy or it's not as beneficial. But one thing I've been able to see firsthand in terms of work I do, I call it the beauty of the group. Because one thing we know, and this podcast definitely helps with that part as well, is PTSD. It makes us feel alone. It makes us feel that no one understands. No one knows what we're going through. It isolates ourselves. It causes a lot of withdrawal for ourselves as well. But one thing we know when we're in a group and we're seeing heads nodding, people saying yes, support coming from other individuals, we're able to recognize, hey, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one going through this. I'm not going crazy. I'm not feeling like the whole world is against me and no one else is ever going to get me. And I feel the support of other people is oftentimes what helps, even sometimes more than the therapist, because again, we have that lived experience piece where the person sitting next to us is able to say, hey, yeah, I'm experiencing this too. Or, yeah, you know what, I don't know exactly what you've gone through, but I can understand some of those impacts because I remember wondering that self-doubt about myself. I remember feeling that anger. I remember feeling that rage. I remember getting that panic when I get that phone call. And I know you've talked about it in terms of some of the other speakers that's been on the show. And they've talked about the power of group or the power of that lived experience piece as well, where people can say, hey, I'm not alone in this journey.
I really do believe that those who are listening, you also have to, and I've said this on a previous episode, but you also have to let go of feeling that what you've endured is not nearly as bad as what others have. And that is something that I struggle with a long time. And so the idea as well of group sessions was for me to sit down and say, well, I came upon this and I saw that, and this is something that stuck out. And I was sort of thinking that I must be fucking embarrassed when some other people were talking. And I'm like, what's wrong with me? The reality is that every single person goes through a completely different situation. And as I mentioned again in a previous podcast, was that I was surprised when a military member had spoken to me about, just he thought it was difficult what police did because you had to just be on and off, be a dad, and all of a sudden go back out into the battle zone. And there's a lot of validation that you cannot get from anyone else but those who have been through the shit, and they understand that. And there is no competitive, I've got the worst fucking war story kind of feeling in those groups at all. And they're fantastic, Brandon. They're fantastic. If you could comment, this is something that definitely hangs up a lot of people. Stigmatization. Is the tide turning with regards to the stigmas around mental health? Is it still quite alive? What are your thoughts on that?
It's definitely turning. Has it fully turned to where we want it to be? Definitely not. Again, we're seeing that in the systems. And I think that's where the biggest change is needed. I think in terms of the individual pieces, we're seeing a lot of positive work being done. We're seeing a lot of initiatives happen where people are talking about things more in terms of, we're seeing things like Bell Let's Talk. We're seeing people talk about things more. We're seeing more TV shows talk about it. We're seeing things in positive light in terms of understanding mental health and wanting to get more educated. But one thing I think the change needs to be is at the systematic level. What are we doing in terms of decreasing barriers for people? What are we doing in terms of increasing those supports in non-judgmental ways? One thing we definitely see in the first responders world is the judgment in terms of, oh, you signed up for this work, or this is what it is, or you knew what you're going to be getting into. No one deserves to be traumatized. No one deserves to feel that fight or flight response at 2 o'clock in the morning when they're home with their families where it's supposed to be their safe place. No one deserves to have their well-being threatened in terms of not having that sense of support from their supervisors, from their higher-ups. And in terms of that mentality of he's just off on a stress leave, or they're just wimping out, or they're just not manning up, that's where we need to see some changes in terms of what systems and policies are going to do. In my thoughts.
Brandon, for those who are not following you yet on Instagram, I know you do a reel on Thursdays. Could you discuss that and tell people how they can track you down?
Yep, definitely. So outside of working with individuals with trauma, I also been involved in the field of sports social work. So it's looking at the mental impacts and athletes in terms of understanding how do we shatter that stigma as well, which, because again, very similar to that warrior mentality. So one thing we've been doing on the page of Wellness Athletic Services is doing Therapy Thursday, where we do different tips and advice on, what's a different tool or skill you can try out that might be helpful for your mental health. What are different understandings of what therapy is? You can check this out on Facebook or on Instagram at Wellness Athletic Services, or even on our website at wellnessathleticservices.com. So those are different ways that people can get in touch with us, send us a message. If someone has any other questions, feel free to reach out. Always down to have a conversation. Again, anything we can do to promote mental well-being and mental wellness, love to hear it. And one thing, if I may, Larry, one little tip I'll give to our listeners here today, and I call use tip as a bit of a pun, because again, there's one thing, especially when our emotions are heightened and we're trying to bring ourselves back down quickly. One thing we talk about is it's called tip skill. So it stands for TIPP. P, change the body temperature. We know when we're feeling overwhelmed, when our anxiety is high, our blood pressure is up, our body temperature increases. So how do we bring ourselves back down quickly? Something like taking an ice pack or putting our face in something cold, like cold water, splashing water on our face. Those things can help decrease the body temperature so we can be able to self-regulate and self-soothe. Intense exercise. How do we burn off the energy? We talked about that energy that's built up inside. So it might be a sprint, jumping jacks, push-ups, something to burn off that high intense energy that we got built up. The 2 P's is paced breathing and progressive muscle relaxation. 2 different mindfulness techniques so we can decrease our blood pressure and we can regulate our breathing. Instead of breathing from our chest, we're breathing from our stomach and our diaphragm. So we're able to take those full breaths. So again, we're able to put our frontal cortex back online instead of living within our hippocampus and our alarm systems.
That's great tips. I'm here writing things down as you're going. I love it. I really appreciate you coming on to the show today. Again, this is important for a lot of people who are listening, who are struggling, and who have not yet felt comfortable to cross that line of seeking help. You've given a lot of great analogies today. You've given a lot of great tips today, and you've spoken quite well with regards to mental health, the stigmas, and the need for people to come out and talk. Before we end the show, is there anything else that you would like to add? This is your time. Feel free to say what you like.
First of all, I just want to say thank you again, Larry, for this platform, because I think it's a conversation that needs to be had more and more. And I'm glad to hear so many people open to sharing their story in terms of, reaching out, in terms of connecting to find their own sense of wellness. Because again, each individual deserves their own wellness. It doesn't matter what your background or experience, your work has been when you've been impacted. Again, I go back to what a therapist said to me, even a barber, got to go to a barber to get their hair cut. So it doesn't matter what your line of work is or what our mind says in terms of, you don't deserve this, or you don't need this, or you should know all this. You still deserve that sense of well-being. And the other part I often say to people is that it's the journey of recovery. Sometimes we think we get in this mindset of, I'm recovered now. I don't need to practice my meditation. I don't need to practice my mindfulness. I don't need to reach out to my supports. I don't need to practice the things that make me well. But it's important to remind ourselves, okay, it's no different than if we drink water for 8 weeks straight and then we stop, we're going to see the impacts on our physical health. So it's maintaining those positive things in our mental health, because again, recovery is a lifelong thing that we're going to be continuing to do the positive things to keep our mental health in a positive place.
There you go. And you threw out another one with the water. You're filled with them, man. They really hit home, Brandon. I like that, man. That's awesome.
Those things where people can kind of think of real life examples. Again, I'm not a big fan of big fancy words, so I try to use everyday examples that we have around us.
Awesome. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. And I do, again, appreciate the kudos for the podcast. The entire point of it, the entire concept of it was to be able to stand up, to speak out, and to have some sort of a voice for all those who are struggling in silence. And I hope that those who are tuned in, you're sharing it with people that you know are struggling. You're sharing it with your loved ones so they can have an idea of what you're experiencing. You share it with your friends, your family, and you just listen. And feel free to message me. Brandon has also said, feel free to contact him. Reach out, talk. Don't carry all that weight on your shoulders. I really don't care how broad they are, how strong you are. You're worth more. Step away from the concerns about stigmatization. Step away from the concerns about repercussions, because ultimately your life, your well-being is more important than any job. My name is Larry Payton. I have your 6. Please also have mine.
Don't go away. There's so much left to do, so many things I wanna say, and I say, don't make the change. If it rains every single day, I'll fight to blow it all away.